Hello, everyone. I'm Janet Salmons, Methods Guru for MethodSpace. And I'm here today with Liz Shrubowski to talk a little bit about ethnography on, offline, and in between. But first, if you're new to MethodSpace, this is a blog community sponsored by Sage Publishing. And we're interested in all things to do with designing, conducting, analyzing research, writing about it, and sharing our results in new and traditional ways. So I'm excited that you're able to join me here today, Liz. And why don't you just begin by introducing yourself and telling us a little bit about your book?
Great. Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me today. And before I get started into what I wanted to say, I just want to take a moment to reflect on the Indigenous lands that I'm coming from and invite all of our listener viewers to reflect on the Indigenous lands that you are wherever you are in the world. I'm speaking with you in Southern California and just want to recognize the original and current caretakers of this land, water, and air, the Cahuilla, Tongva, Luiseño, and Serrano peoples, and all of their ancestors and descendants, past, present, and future. And I want to continue.
And I'm speaking from the lands that were originally Arapaho and Ute.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Janet. Yeah. And I also want to continue by acknowledging that it is wonderful that we are able to do this physically distance, and it's wonderful that we're able to use this video technology. But I recognize that this is a challenging time for a lot of folks, and both in research and in other ways. So I just want to put that into this space as well. So if you don't mind, I'll share a couple of slides here about the work that I have. Great. So just a couple of things to get started with is I am currently an assistant professor of ethnomusicology. I'm at the University of California, Riverside. And the book that we're talking about today was published by Sage last summer in 2020. And it's based on over a decade of research that I've done researching with hip hop musicians and other popular musicians, primarily in the US and Canada. And I've been doing face-to-face ethnography, online ethnography, and blended research, which is the focus of the book and the focus of what we'll be talking about here today. And when this came out in the summer of 2020, it was a scary and strange time for research. And we are still in a place where we're thinking maybe expansively and creatively about what it means to be doing ethnography in times of COVID. And I'll take a look here just at the book itself. And something that I know, Janet, you were interested in talking about was what is hybrid ethnography, right?
Right, because I think, particularly it seems like in the qualitative research world, but terms are not universally defined. So I think it's always a good idea to begin by telling us what these terms mean to you.
Yeah, thanks. That's a really important point, right? What do we mean by the words that we're circulating, and when do we need to sort of peel back the curtain a little bit to reveal what that is? Mm-hmm. When I'm talking about hybrid ethnography, what I'm referencing is a research methodology for participant observation that spans online, offline, and blended aspects of a field site. In other words, it invites us to conceptualize a field site that has a variety of subparts and interrelated aspects, some of which may be online, some of which may be offline, and many of which might not really fit that definition exactly of being one or the other. And so in this particular moment, I am talking with colleagues and students who are starting new projects online, but conceptualizing that in the future, they hope to be able to bring them into a hybrid online-offline sphere. Mm-hmm. And also just talking with people through the process of what happens when a site that maybe we had previously primarily encountered in physical space suddenly has a much more robust online presence, and then invites us to think about the online and offline spaces and the way that they interact with each other. And, you know, in terms of a 21st century research landscape, most of the people that we are working with have some kind of online presence, and most participants, as well as ethnographers, have some kind of access to mobile phones, to Wi-Fi, to other technologies that mean that even if we might have thought we were offline, the phone is there, and so we're online to a certain degree, right? That there's a kind of movement between that we use these technologies to mean that these spheres are not really fully separate. So something that I've been doing in the past year, then thinking through this hybrid ethnography, has been working with musicians and music industry professionals who I know about the way that they're adapting to physical distancing, the way that they're adapting to online concerts and online concert spaces, right? Because another question that often arrives is, when is it helpful to think about a hybrid ethnographic study, and what kinds of projects fit well with this kind of methodological orientation? And I think realistically, anytime the folks who are in your scene are moving among online and offline spaces, it's very, very helpful to adapt aspects of this approach to your own research. And anytime you're thinking through internet-based tools, social media, et cetera, as well as the kind of large amounts of data that emerge from working in a at least partially online field site, it can be really helpful. The way that I've written the book is that it's very adaptable. So I'm thinking about expressive culture, that's where I'm coming from, and many of these tools are able to be adapted to a variety of different research sites. And also it's really written with this kind of openness that I know that, you know, you as researcher are coming in with a very particular skill set and set of expertise. And it's definitely a malleable kind of approach that you are able to then tailor to what you're doing specifically.
Well, I like the way that you've described the kind of population and setting you're studying, because you know, looking at their use of technology, and you know, that's common in so many different topic areas today. I mean, there certainly are, you know, kinds of research that, you know, would not be appropriate to do online because the population is not online. But I think that that's changing so rapidly at this time. So having a flexible approach to look at, you know, the whole possible story seems like really useful.
Yeah, and maybe it's helpful also to talk a little bit about why I wrote this book and how I got into this, right? I ended up starting this research at a time when online ethnography was just entering into the sort of peer-reviewed canon. And during my earlier studies, we were largely thinking about the field site as a physical space, and then started to get these invitations into conceptualizing online worlds and largely research that just existed within these online worlds. And I used that as an invitation to think about practically what changes when we're doing online research, and also some of the theoretical changes that we need to make in our approach. Like, how do we think differently about sociality when it is online? How do we think differently about participant observation when our participants come from all over the world in a way that just is not replicated in the same way in a face-to-face field site, right? So that was exciting. And also, it wasn't yet at the place where the sort of rapid movement between the online and offline that I observed with folks I was working with wasn't yet really robustly reflected in the scholarship, right? I'm working with artists, I'm working with musicians, I'm working with, you know, DJs, even, you know, listeners, right? For whom the movement between now I'm going to refer to a video in real time and we're going to watch it while we're face to face was incredibly normal. But that kind of rapid shift was not yet normalized in scholarship. Right. And so essentially what I was doing was using my experience working with folks, seeing what worked and what didn't, to allow the method to catch up with where people were already operating in their daily lives.
Right, right. So maybe you could talk a little bit more about, you know, the kinds of questions researchers might use your book as a guide to approach.
Yeah. Thanks for that question. It might help for me to let's look at the table of contents, and I think that kind of gives us an idea of what happens in the book. And I mentioned earlier that it's a malleable and open invitation to adapt this as folks need to for their individual research sites, and certainly as, you know, very experienced researchers, you know, you might be watching this now with decades of research experience, but thinking about how might you adapt this to a growing online edge in your own field, right? Or maybe thinking of a new research project from the beginning, or maybe even if you're in your field methods training now, thinking about how can you conceptualize from the beginning something that's a little bit more hybrid. All of that is very, very welcome. So what I do in the book, and you can kind of see it from the contents here, is I move with the project the way that research projects often, but not always, unfold, right? So we're thinking about project design, and that includes pre-field preparation. And actually in the first couple chapters, I talk about designing research questions, thinking about research questions and the kinds of research questions that fit well with this kind of approach, right? Then we move through the nuts and bolts of the field work, the experience of the field work, reflecting on the experience of the field work, and then going into analysis and sharing research. And you can also kind of think about it as in thirds, where the first third of the book is about theoretical and practical concerns that arise pre-field. The second is really set in field. And then the last chapters are about analysis, about presenting findings. And also that last chapter is about responding to ongoing changes, right? A friend of mine said that they were really excited to see this book in, you know, June, July of 2020, and that it was the first one that they'd seen in social sciences that referred to the pandemic, right? Now we've had a full year of people thinking about COVID realities, the way they impact research, et cetera, as well as some other aspects related to changes in technology access, right? We know that access to Wi-Fi, access to cell phones, access to materials continues to be unequal, right? And the way that we think about that also changes over time. All this to say that no guide that is completed at a particular time will ever be will ever respond to everything that happens in the future. So it's intentionally sort of open-ended about the way that we can think through things as they change.
So where might the hybrid approach, you know, how might that work for someone who has, you know, started their research thinking about doing it in person, and now with the pandemic is, you know, needs to shift online, or you know, maybe kind of moving back and forth. I don't think I have not seen that covered in any other book. So I think, you know, you really have something unique to add here. So maybe you could talk a little bit more about how you know, what you recommend for researchers in those situations.
Yeah. No, thank you for that question. And want to encourage folks to think about a couple different things that come up in that situation. One is, obviously, there are practical, research-based questions that need to be asked and answered in that scenario. Something else that we maybe don't talk about as much as we should, but that I've definitely seen working with colleagues and students, et cetera, is the feeling of, oh no, what is going to happen? Is this a disaster, right? Like, and that's real, right? Because we are humans going through something that is a disaster, and we're trying to respond to it. And so maybe let's kind of zoom out for a minute, and I'll go back here to kind of signal that I'm zooming out with you. I find that it's helpful as we are thinking through the sort of possibly panic-inducing aspects of these changes,
Right.
to remind ourselves about the things that haven't changed, or at least that haven't totally gone away. And I've been thinking a lot about an interaction that I had years ago, an interview that I did years ago that was just fabulous. And it keeps coming to my mind at this time. It was one of those interviews that we all sort of dream about, right? Where finally we'd had a lot of informal conversations, and now we were going to sit down and record and talk on the record. And I had questions, and we had media pieces, and everything just kind of clicked, right? I asked questions that, for the artist I was working with, he had these ideas that kind of bubbled up at the time. And I could feel that in that dialogue, we were actually coming to new understandings, right? That had never occurred before. It was, those sort of moments where the dialogue is producing new meanings and is creating, exciting avenues for future thought. We were working with media as well, right? I had some recordings of his music, and we would listen to some things and kind of talk through it and build on it. And this is something that I talk about in the book as well, right? Thinking about the kind of 21st century audience, some of it was based on the research question that I was bringing, and some of it was also thinking about what would be exciting and interesting to other folks, right? So we did a recording and ended up broadcasting on air. We did a podcast from it. So, we had these multiple audiences that were going to get to engage with us. It was great. And I bring it up now, Janet, because we did that interview on the phone. So there are so many things that we need to be ready for and adapt to, but we have a lot of these tools already, right? The skills that we use to make a phone conversation into something that is productive and has that feeling of liveness, and that, knows kind of how to compensate for things like lag, and the fact that it's a different kind of liveness, right? We have some of those tools that we can bring forward. That said, some of the questions that I've gotten about what does it mean to shift a research project in this time, it can be helpful, I think, to actually go all the way back to the design phase, to look at the research question and to ask, does this research question still make sense given the reality of this moment, right? And I am not suggesting that everyone change their research questions to be about online communication. I don't think that is helpful and productive. However, I think it's helpful and productive to think about, are there aspects of the research question, for example, that deal primarily with liveness? Are there aspects of the research question that are about the way that people interact in a particular physical space that folks no longer have access to right now?
Right.
What might you need to bracket and say, okay, phase one of the research project is going to address the aspects of the question that either can be done now or can be adapted now. And phase two of the research project are going to think about liveness, are going to think about movement through shared physical space in a way that can be nuanced appropriately when those things start to become part of the research landscape again, right? So sometimes it does mean thinking about the research question and then the research process in a way that is just reflective of the realities that we are in now, and being okay with needing to maybe change or adapt certain aspects as they happen. It's also really helpful to keep in mind that as ethnographers, we're not in this alone, right? We have a community of practice, right? The participants who we're working with. And it's entirely possible that some of the questions that seemed the most pressing a year and a half, 2 years ago, might not be the same questions that seem the most pressing to our collaborators now. And as ethnographers, part of our responsibility is to keep our ears open. So when folks say, now this other thing really matters the most to me, well, then we adapt so that we can be with our community of research in those questions.
So I know you have a chapter about ethics in your book. Could you maybe talk a little bit about some of the kinds of ethical dilemmas that people face, especially doing online ethnography?
Yeah, thanks for that. Let's see, I'll find another slide here that I think will help us. It'll take me just a moment.
Sure.
So Janet, I actually want to add one thing before we get there, if that's okay. Something that I have been thinking about and talking with people about that actually refers to your last question, which is about how might we need to kind of go back to our methodological toolbox as we're thinking through changes due to pandemic interactions. And something that is helpful to keep in mind is, might there be methods of inquiry that we hadn't thought about previously as related to our own studies that now become more important? And something that is really helpful in a moment like this is to think about, okay, how are you as researcher perhaps interacting differently than you might have been before? Are you as researcher perhaps in a situation where you're spending more time by yourself, where you're spending more time focusing on your own experience of a scene? And for some research questions and for some scenes, it makes sense to think about something like autoethnography or another tool that maybe you hadn't previously thought was going to be as important, where perhaps focusing on a smaller number of participants or taking the time to really do a deep dive into the literature and to learning more about how autoethnography works as a strategy could be helpful, because some of the kinds of things that are less easily knowable through a Zoom screen, we are able to access in ourselves. And so you might ask the question, is this a good time to think about how my particular interaction, my embodied experience working through technology, right, might become a helpful way to approach the question? And could that be something that you might want to add to what you're doing? So just to kind of add that to what I was saying just a moment ago. And now to your question about ethics. Let's look here. All right, so, in hybrid ethnography, when we are working online, whether or not COVID ends up being something that we're really focusing on, we're already thinking about different kinds of ethics standards, right? We have our ethics standards as individuals. We have maybe if you're at a university or a nonprofit or another institution, they have the standards that they are holding you to. Professional societies have their own standards. And when we're working in online communities, to your question about what happens differently online or in a hybrid field, sometimes online sites have their own standards of ethics. So in the book, I make a reference to an ethnographer who's working in Wikipedia, right? And Wikipedia actually, they publish for the users what they consider to be their code of conduct for using their particular site, and it's really clear. In other online sites, it might take a little bit more digging to understand what are the kind of community ethics standards here, what expectations are people held to. If you end up working in something like a Facebook group or another group that has its own sort of rules, you could look at what are their expectations for how people behave in this particular sub-site. And I think it's really useful to just remember that we need to pay attention to that extreme granular, knowing that folks are coming with a variety of different attitudes and approaches, and that in a particular online community, there are expectations that we need to kind of keep in mind. And at this also relates to some of the larger theoretical kind of questions that we have to deal with when we move into online that I'll maybe talk about in just a moment, if that's okay. Yeah. Something else that I want to say here, though, that I think is really important is the way that we think about ourselves as researchers, the way we think about our members of our research team, those of us working with students, the way we think about the needs of our students, et cetera. And that is that, here we go. For researcher safety and privacy, we have these tools like an ethics board or an IRB that really help us focus on the safety of the other participants. But we don't have as many tools that help us remember that the safety of researchers and the research team and students involved in data collection, et cetera, is also really important. So we want to think about things like what kind of information needs to be shared and with whom in order to think about the ways that people are differently safe online, right? There's been a lot of really solid research that reminds us that female and non-binary people are generally less safe online than male identified people, right? Folks of color, folks with different kinds of backgrounds may be subject to more kinds of online harassment, right? People with particular ideological positions might be more likely to be doxxed or have other kinds of online harassment against them. And it's really useful then to think about, okay, where's the amount of information that needs to be shared to create a sense of that we're in this together, that we're being honest, right? The kinds of things that you would want to tell a person face to face because it's just part of regular human interaction, right? How much of that sharing needs to be happening in open settings, and what kinds of sharing do we need to move to more private settings, just knowing that the possibility for information to be shared beyond the space in which it was originally intended to be shared is really exacerbated in online communication. So a kind of a reminder that we should be taking care of each other when it comes to ethics and online research.
Right. And I think it's a real balancing act, because I mean, one of the things I've written a lot about is establishing your credibility as a researcher, and in depending on the nature of the study, making a personal connection, but how much you want to share and what you want to share, some caution is needed. And especially if you're a student researcher watching this and thinking about the ways you might interact online with your friends and the kinds of things you might be willing to reveal about yourself, that those may not be the same kinds of things you want to share in this situation, where really what you're trying to establish is what the participant might need to know about you that will help them to trust you and begin to build rapport and as you say, you know, where you want to share those kinds of pieces of information.
Yeah, and you know, this does some of the training that is available through institutions and ethics boards, et cetera, that helps us think about participant safety and privacy is really, really helpful here, obviously for fellow participants and for ourselves, right? When we think about things like, when do you need to quote something directly? And when, if you quote something directly, even if you remove the name of the original person who posted it, well, someone could put that into a search engine and re-find it, right? So there are ways that things that are in publicly accessible forums, or forums that are accessible, even if not to the general public, but to some subset of users, right? That information can become re-identified in a way that we need to be really careful about, right? Not that we can't do this research, but that we need to always come at it with thoughts and maybe an extra level of care around the way that data is going to be shared, and maybe think about what needs to be shared and with whom. And there might be other ways, you know, aggregating data, paraphrasing instead of quoting, et cetera, that can help with some of these ethical issues.
So what else would you like our MethodSpace readers to know about this approach that would help them to move forward? And
yeah, thanks for that question. I know that earlier I gestured towards some of the theoretical shifts that we get invited to think into. So I might, just spend a little bit of time there. Let me just, again, I'll just navigate here. All right, so I mentioned, I think from the way the book is laid out, some of the really practical concerns are done in such a way that it should be really accessible. Some of the theoretical concerns are things that are threaded throughout the book, and ethics has its own chapter, but some of the things we've been talking about, ethical questions and concerns, really come throughout the book as a whole. Few other things that I think it's just helpful to think about as researchers, right? What does it mean to be in a hybrid field site, and how might we sort of reorient our thinking and adapt the questions that we're asking? Something that I think is really useful first is to think about the way that the producer-consumer divide is shifted in an online setting, right? So obviously we are no longer, ethnographers have for a very long time not been the only people who are recording social interaction, right? That's not new. What's exciting is when we're interpreting media in the hybrid field, we get to encounter content that we make, content that fellow researchers make, content that participants make, as well as the thing that we might have thought as being the sort of products that we're thinking about. So, for example, we have, in expressive culture in particular, right, maybe from a laptop at home, someone is taking video from a show pre-COVID, who knows, and then editing it in some way, adding their own spin to it, sharing it on their own social media network, using hashtags and other tools to embed it in kind of a network of circulation. And all of those things become part of the life of that media object. So we get to think about, well, then who is that person, right? They're neither purely producer nor purely consumer, right? So many of us and many of the folks that we're working with end up being artists, content makers, and like content beyond just like a performance or something, right? Audience members, readers, and all of these roles change based on time, as well as location and purpose. Next thing that I want to just touch on briefly here is what I was mentioning earlier, right? This idea that we have to think about what the field is, right? We know that anytime we do a research study, we are creating the field, right?
Mm-hmm.
Even if it is a physical space, we're deciding what is and isn't part of it. When we're thinking through online ethnography and hybrid ethnography, that becomes even more expansive in terms of what we might choose, this Facebook group and not that one, right? This Twitch stream and not that one, right? That we are constituting the field, and that the social norms are determined based on, in a lot of ways, where folks are coming from. Mm-hmm. So what are the kind of modes of sociality, and potentially the multiple modes of sociality, as we're engaging with people who are in this moment in a variety of different geographic and cultural spaces and interacting together. So we really get to think about what that means and how those are determined. And that's where some of the things like thinking about the specific norms of behavior or rules of engagement in a particular online site can be really helpful. Thinking about participants and our own internal multiplicities is another sort of theoretical shift that we're making, right? Because we have our own selves, right, as physical embodied people. And then we also get, for example, I work a lot with performing musicians, right? So I get to know someone as an individual. I also get to see their stage persona. That's already another self that's, different in degrees, right? And then maybe they have a professional Twitter account, a professional Facebook page, a personal Facebook page, right? A personal Instagram account. And we're all kind of moving in between all of these different aspects of ourselves. And so even the idea of who are the participants, we have this conceptual shift as we need to consider all of these different aspects that are incorporating the identities of ourselves and also the folks that we're working with in a hybrid space.
Well, and in some cases where some part of it, they may be using their real names, and in other parts they're using other kinds of pseudonyms and avatars, and so depending on the nature of the study, there can be all kinds of identity questions to consider.
Yeah, and that question of why might a single individual have multiple online personas, right? How do we probe that question and ask, and what does it mean in terms of the way they're interacting in that particular social setting?
Right.
When is it part of social norms? When is it in maybe opposition to certain social norms? Those are all really rich and interesting questions to delve into. Absolutely. Yeah. Something else that is a theoretical shift that also has some pragmatic implications is thinking about time and space in a particular field, right? When do we need to be synchronous? When do we need to be asynchronous? In terms of if we're working across multiple time zones, right? That has a kind of a practical angle, but also the nature of communication has some differences if we're thinking about, are Janet and I having this conversation in real time, or am I taking some time to think about a question, formulate a response, post it later, and then when the researcher jumps in, there's a conversation that's been going on for a long time that they're sort of reading and catching up on, right? So there's also that shift in terms of how do we think about communication when it may be both asynchronous and synchronous across different aspects of the field site, right? And then maybe let's just do maybe one more point to kind of lead us out of this is thinking about relevant analytical approaches and tools, right? So thinking about not just, what might be some useful software for data management, but also what does it mean as ethnographers to think about who has created different kinds of content? What are the reasons that folks have for altering or sharing it? And when might there be other influences, like Is someone making money on this? Is someone working on developing a persona for this, right? That help us interpret this large amount of data that we're encountering in the hybrid field. So it takes the really critical skills of the ethnographer and developing additional skills with some of these data tools to come together to interpret them in a way that makes sense for a particular field site.
Well, before we close, is there anything else you would like to add that might be helpful to new researchers who are thinking about this kind of ethnography?
Yeah, thanks for asking. I will go back here. And I want to emphasize something that we've been talking about throughout this whole conversation is how much is changing all the time, right? And that change is normal in ethnography, right? In any kind of ethnography, there are times when something that we think might happen doesn't happen, or something that we didn't anticipate was going to happen does, and it ends up being rich and fabulous and interesting. So especially for newer researchers, just remembering that uncertainty is part of the process, and that uncertainty is to be expected, right? It's kind of a funny thing to say, but it's true, right? And so it is to be expected that in a new online or hybrid research setting, there are going to be some things that don't go as anticipated, and changing based on what happens is very, very important. I also want to go back, and here's the link to the book is here, Jen, and I know that you've also shared some pieces on MethodSite as well. I would encourage folks to remember when the kinds of when things happen that are challenging, right? When we encounter those moments of difficulty, when we have a massive amount of data to try to understand, or when something happens that wasn't what we had hoped was going to happen, to just go back to the beginning of the process, that moment of asking the question, of being excited about doing the research, and to just remember what drove you to do this. What is exciting? What is relevant? What are the things that you're hoping are going to come out of this study that might be helpful and relevant to the people that you're working with, right? How can what you're doing be something that is of use to other folks as well? And to let that kind of personal curiosity and also applicability kind of motivate you through the moments that are challenging, because there are a lot of them, and that's part of the process too.
And sometimes stepping back and having conversations, maybe even with people who are not engaged in the research field, but when you try to explain what you're doing, sometimes that can help you to reconnect with your initial motivations as you're discussing, and rather than being kind of hung up on the details that can take a lot of time to negotiate, but might obscure the excitement that you hope will come through with your participants and with the people who are reading what you've done. So, well, thank you so much for sharing this, and I hope that it will be helpful to researchers, especially, you know, in our world, whether we're dealing with a post-pandemic environment or not. Increasingly, our lives are hybrid, on and offline, and so finding ways to conduct research that will reflect and embrace and maximize, you know, our understanding of that will be, I think, very helpful.
Thank you, Janet, and thanks for inviting me to do this, and for your really helpful questions. I appreciate it.